Chapter 3, the Food Supply Screencast 5. This is the final screencast for Chapter 3, and this screencast is focusing on environmental contaminants in foods. Now, there are a number of different sources, and some real common examples would be heavy metals. The most common of these would be lead, mercury. If we look at industrial chemicals, so dioxins, polychlorinated biphenyls. And one thing we kind of have to keep in mind here, Western New York in particular has a history of what have become to be known as Superfund sites. And the best example would be Love Canal outside of Buffalo, one of the most notorious chemical dumping zones resulting in a number of cancer clusters. So that's something we need to keep in mind. And other potential would be agricultural chemicals, so pesticides and antibiotics. So these are all things that can somehow make their way from the environment into our food supply. Now, lead is the first that we're going to take a look at, and lead can actually do damage to every organ in the body, but specifically the nervous system and kidneys are vulnerable to lead poisoning. And what happens basically here, this will impact and impair the synthesis of hemoglobin. So now you're looking at someone that's not going to be able to produce the primary protein that's responsible for oxygen transport. Lead especially is of issue in the developing nervous system of children. And what has been documented as directly linked to lead poisoning, lower IQ, impaired coordination, growth, and hearing, behavioral disorders, and also predisposition of children to high blood pressure and kidney disorders. So all of these have been tied in to lead poisoning. Now, probably one of the examples would be home plumbing and lead-based paints. A couple years ago at MCC, a large number of pipes and plumbing had to be replaced because of lead poisoning. That's the reason why in Building 7 you see the new water fountains that actually have filter bottles. There was a period of time in which no one was allowed to use the bathrooms. Water was actually purchased, bottled water, and made available, and so on, due to the lead that was found in the pipes. But lead-based paints also are an issue. I know I live in a very old home, and I actually have leaded windows. So my house is probably a disaster with regards to lead overall. Now, there's other containers that we see that may potentially have lead. So leaded crystal, pottery, candies from Mexico. There has been evidence that some very cheap toys imported from China may contain lead. If we look at vegetables that have been grown in contaminated soil, if we look at some dietary supplements, so there are numerous resources for lead poisoning overall. Now, arsenic is another, and it is a toxic element found in soil and water throughout the world, and there are actually legal limits as to how much of this arsenic can be found in the ground. Now, the toxin and carcinogen is linked to poor fetal growth, adverse immune and neurodevelopmental outcomes in infants and children, and cancer in adults. Now, one source, rice, especially brown, is the major source of inorganic arsenic in our diets. So there is definitely concern about infant cereals that are rice-based. Now, what's recommended for limiting exposure to arsenic would be feeding babies and toddlers a variety of grains, so not just rice. Consume white rice in place of brown rice occasionally, and also cooking rice in excess water. And what that does, that actually will get rid of the arsenic. Now, dioxins and PCBs, these are a byproduct of industrial processes and incineration of waste. We do know that they increase the risk of cancer, and as I said before, Love Canal just outside of Buffalo was known for a major cancer cluster, and that's really where Aaron Brockovich actually got involved for the first time. We know that these chemicals can cause liver and nerve damage. They may have an adverse effect on reproduction. We may see an increase in the risk of type 2 diabetes mellitus. And generally, the primary food source is freshwater fish from contaminated waterways. And there's definitely guidelines for fish consumption and moderation, which is actually important. Now, mercury, this is something that you're probably familiar with. So it's actually the form of methyl mercury. And it's known to play a role in causing nerve damage, fatigue, and decreased learning abilities. Fish are the primary food sources, and those individuals that are most at risk for mercury poisoning are going to be children, pregnant women, and breastfeeding women. So definitely looking at the most vulnerable amongst us. Now, there are guidelines for children and women who may become pregnant or are pregnant or breastfeeding to limit mercury in the diet. One would be 8 to 12 ounces of a variety of fish a week. Choose fish lower in mercury, so salmon, shrimp, pollock, canned light tuna, tilapia, catfish, cod. Avoid 4 types of fish in particular. So tilefish from the Gulf of Mexico, shark, swordfish, and king mackerel. These in particular, so shark, swordfish, and king mackerel, they are high up on the food chain. And so they tend to have greater amounts of mercury because they consume lots of smaller fish that have consumed mercury. And it's an exponential increase in the amount of mercury that's found in those fish in particular. When eating fish you or others have caught, pay attention to fish advisories for where the fish was actually caught. So what stream, river, or lake. Is that a water source that's known for contamination potentially? The last environmental potential for contamination are pesticides and antibiotics. And there's 2 different types. We have synthetic, and these would be the earliest types of pesticides, and they did not break down easily, but those that are currently in use today do. Also, biopesticides, they were developed to provide safer alternatives. Now, there are some problems associated with pesticide use. One, somewhat similar to bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, some of the organisms eventually become resistant to the pesticide. And there's a drift, and what that means basically that pesticide may actually spread, especially through sewer water, things like that. The pesticide may be taken up by non-target organisms. The potential for it to enter our groundwater or aquatic habitats. They may be harmful to non-target species, decreasing biological diversity, disrupt wildlife habitats, damage soil and nutrients, impact or create poor water quality, and contribute to erosion. So these have some pretty significant impacts with their use. Now, the regulation of pesticides is actually between 3 organizations. So the EPA, FDA, and the USDA. So the EPA will determine if the pesticide is beneficial. They're going to make sure pesticides do not pose health or environmental risks, and they set the limits. The FDA and USDA, they actually test foods for pesticides, and they're responsible for enforcing the EPA pesticide tolerances. Now, there's a number of things that you can do to actually minimize your exposure to pesticides. For example, you want to make sure you wash and peel fruits and vegetables, select a variety of foods, trim away fat and meat. Infants and young children are also a special consideration. Potentially, they can consume higher doses relatively of pesticides because of their lower body weight. And also, they may not metabolize the pesticides as readily as adults because the liver has not reached full maturity. Antibiotics are recently in the news, and a lot of antibiotics are given to food animals to promote growth and prevent or treat disease. The concern here is that the use of antibiotics will foster the growth and spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria strains, and that is something that we are very concerned with. There are not a lot of antibiotics that have been produced recently that are strong enough, and many bacteria out there have actually become resistant due to the overuse of antibiotics. And so these antibiotic resistant bacteria, they're very difficult to treat, and there's a greater likelihood of death from these bacterial strains because we don't have the antibiotics that are typically used to treat these bacteria because they are now resistant. Here this is not something I'm going to ask on the exam, but what we have here is a list of U.S. agencies that are responsible for monitoring the food supply. We've kind of talked about these. If we look at the Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Environmental Protection Agency, National Marine Fisheries Services, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and then let's throw some state and local governments in there too. So that's a lot of government agencies that are involved here, and we already know that one of the things that they don't do very well is communicate amongst each other. There are also concerns now due to hiring freezes at the federal level that some of these agencies just do not have the staff to monitor our food and water supply as effectively as possible. So something to keep in mind.